Welcome into Blues Hub Instant Reaction, and we are talking about the trade deadline. Blues not making any moves today, to some surprise and also none surprise, to say the least. Blues Hub is sponsored by Hot Shots, St. Louis home for all the games all the time since 1990. Jacob Stanoch alongside Thomas Welch. We'll see if we can get anyone else here to discuss the quiet front by Doug Armstrong. There's certainly a lot of quotes coming out of the press conference. But Thomas, start us off. What's your opinions on the no moves today?
Well, I think it was kind of what we talked about. They could do a whole bunch of nothing. They could do a whole bunch of something, and they could just do a little bit of something. So obviously they chose to do nothing, but I think it was surprising for me and a lot of people that, obviously Colton Parayko goes down, minutes eaters on the defensive end. You would think they'd go out and kind of at least provide some kind of security net in terms of a right-handed defenseman to kind of come in and help eat those minutes. They chose not to. They called up Matthew Kessel. So it just seems like a lot of pressure on him for a guy that, has some limited NHL experience, but not a whole lot. And then also obviously Justin Falk, who has a ton of NHL experience, but has sort of struggled at times this season. So we'll see how those guys can help manage the load along with the rest of the guys on the defensive end. But it was nice to see Braden Shen not moving. It looked like the Blues, obviously didn't get the return that they wanted. And he elected to use his no trade clause to deny a request to go there anyways. So that's good to know that your captain is locked into the city of St. Louis. And just, I think this is Doug Armstrong telling the team, I see the way you guys are playing. You're scalding hot right now. It feels like this team has a core, but it's not the same level of a hardened core that existed in 2019. So for Doug Armstrong to say hey, I like the guys that we have in the room. I like the way that they're playing right now. Let's see where they can take us. I think instills confidence in everyone in the room, obviously, including the vets, but really that's huge for the young guys, being oh my gosh, my GM believes in me and believes in us to help propel this team to the playoffs, even without one of your best players of the season in Colton Parayko. So I think that's my biggest takeaway from today's deadline.
So as you see, Jamal Myers will be joining us here in a second. And here he is. Jamal, talk to us about the trade deadline. What are your opinions with the Blues not making any moves? Oh, we apologize for that. Some technical difficulties going across. Hopefully, we can get those figured out. We can get his opinion on that. But so while we're waiting for Jamal, take a look at some of the talks or some of the quotes from the press conference. Biggest thing, obviously, Doug Armstrong on making no moves. He said we were in contact with some teams on some hockey trades. At the end of the day, we ended up moving forward with the team that is playing excellent hockey right now. And obviously to him, that felt like that is right now what he wants to see from the team. So Jamal, thanks for joining us here. Let's get your opinion on the Blues and not making moves here today at the deadline.
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded situation. There's a few layers to unpack for me with what happened. And I think that some of it has to do with the fact that the asking price, probably no teams were willing to meet where the Blues are. The fact that they're still right there with, I believe a point or two out from making the playoffs, made it a little more difficult to trade away your captain. The other thing is a lot of the guys that you wanted to trade have terms. So if they're not willing to meet you at your number or what you're asking, then there's really no reason to trade them, because they're under contract beyond this year. It's different if they're unrestricted after this year. Then you certainly want to get something back, want to get a pick back or a player for at some point. But the fact that they have term, you might as well just keep them if they're not willing to meet you where you wanted what you wanted for them. The other thing I'll say is that with Colton Parayko's injury, it kind of made it a little bit more difficult to be willing to part with Justin Falk or Nick Leddy. And so I think that also had a factor in their decision not to move on either of those two guys as well. So it's also, the third point I'll make is it's also a confidence boost, or should be, for the group, that management believes in this group, that they've taken strides in the last few weeks. And part of them are thinking, hey, let's see what you guys can do if you guys can find a way to get in the playoffs.
And just kind of bouncing off at one of the big quotes from Armstrong's press conference. Yeah, he said, right now we're winning on the scoreboard and the underlying stats, and that's something we haven't done for a while. These guys are giving us hope and belief. And I think that really showed today. That was the big question, obviously. Everyone was either on the side of he made up his mind a month ago, or he just made up his mind earlier this week. And that was always the toss-up, and especially following the Four Nations break, they come out incredibly hot and had the winning streak that they did, had pretty much just all the success that they had, and it really kind of flipped I guess you could say, the ideas of what the Blues could do. So I think there was still, at the beginning, not too much they were looking to move if they were planning on moving, but obviously that winning streak threw a wrench into any plans they had. And that certainly, I don't know if it really helped Doug out, or if it did, whether it did or not, but certainly did kind of show today, especially with some of the big trades around the league. We'll talk about that as well, kind of throw in some of those. But talking about the Blues, obviously, the biggest interest in was Braden Shen, and like Jamal said, wasn't meeting the asking price. So Toronto went instead, got Scott Laughlin, or I hope I'm saying that right. But you go in, get a different center, and part of that too was Shen didn't really want to go to Toronto, and I think it was partially he wanted to stay here, and that's another morale boost for the team, knowing that their captain wants to stay with this team.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I think that his older brother Luke played for the Leafs. I'm sure he bounced the idea of going there and what that would mean, and he signed a long-term contract to be a Blue. And so I think that he had every right for him to decide to stay. And it's been in that situation before with Doug Waite. There was a trade on the table for him to go to Anaheim, and he was asking guys what he should do. And he was our de facto captain, if you will. A tremendous amount of pressure on him to stay, and he wanted to stay. Decided ultimately that he would stay, and then they ended up making the trade anyway. But I think you're right. I think when you're the captain, there's a lot more pressure on you in this situation to stay, and I think that probably weighed heavily on his heart, that he would feel somehow like he was leaving the group, and especially since they're so close to making the playoffs. But I really can't overstate the fact that I think the fact that the guys that were considering trading had term on their contract really allowed them to make the decision to keep them. Because when they don't, if they were unrestricted after this year, then you are likely, regardless of them being only a point out of the playoffs, you're likely having to go get something back in return. And I think that it's those two things that play at the same time. And then you layer on, I can't overstate it, you layer on the fact that Colton Parayko was recently injured. You don't want to pull away from the group when they've taken strides in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think just going along with that, like instilling that confidence in the group, not just in Doug Armstrong deciding to stay pat, but like we're talking about your captain deciding that, I could go to greener pastures right now and go to a bona fide Stanley Cup contender in Toronto, or I can stay with the team that I am the captain of that, needs me and is still potentially in the hunt. I think that speaks volumes to the rest of the room too. And specifically the younger guys be like, hey, like Doug Armstrong believes in this group. Braden Shen believes in this group. I believe in this group. It sucks that Colton Parayko goes down after having such a fantastic season, but I think that group thinks they're still capable of making the playoffs. So let's see what they can go do. Should be awesome.
And the real challenge now too, and it's probably even going to be harder. You don't want a little bit of an exhale, right? Exhale that no one got traded, where they stayed pat. They've been kind of pushing down the lever for Monty has for a while now. And so the challenge for this group now is going to be, we've got to push even harder to try to make the playoffs.
So Jamal, kind of looking at Doug Armstrong, he pretty much has gone the way of the players practically tell him what to do, especially with this past year and this past few games, what everything's going on. But that's something that he has always said, pretty much players tell him what to do with their play at the trade deadline. How big is that for a team to have a GM like that, like Doug Armstrong?
Well, I think that what he means by that is their play will determine whether he adds, whether he takes away, whether he retools. It's always the player's decision on what happens. And so when they start to see signs of a team that's played fast of recent, then they start to think, okay, it's not really our team speed. It's not this, it's not that. So it gives the players the confidence to continue to push forward and that they're on the right path. And it gives their coaching staff even more of a voice in the room, that they're on the right path, they're heading in the right direction, which you could say that they've been sputtering up until the last week or month rather. And you've been wondering, okay, which version is the Blues? And now we'll really find out who they really are going down the stretch with a real opportunity to make a push for the playoffs.
All right, Jamal, thank you so much for hopping on and giving us some insight here with the Blues decision.
Appreciate it, guys. Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jamal.
You as well. Stanley Cup champion, former Blue Jamal Meyer, hopping on. And so, Thomas, obviously the takeaway from that, obviously what we've seen, the terms, all that stuff, also play of recently. There was a lot of factors coming into today. And all of those decisions ultimately led to nothing happening, to say the least. But obviously there were those little trades that, something may or may not happen, a bottom six that doesn't get too much ice time, something along those lines, because those aren't crazy trades. They're really not. So, but they were still shopping around a bit just to see if, something could happen.
Yeah, and I think ultimately the biggest takeaway from what happened today, and Jamal phrased it best, is this team really has a chance to show us now what they're capable of, because there's not all that. I mean, I'm sure guys go out there and you hear your name in trade talks and you're gripping the stick extra tight, freaking out, trying to do everything you can to make sure that you don't get traded, because you're basically uprooting your life, right? So it's now that the trade deadline has passed, can those guys, keep that relaxation and knowing that they're going to stay on this team, but also keep that intensity, because this team needs to make it to the playoffs, or wants to make it to the playoffs. So just keeping that compete level to where it's at right now, not being a flash in the pan, but building off of each performance, especially facing the adversity of not having Colton Parayko now. We've talked about it on every show we've been together, Jacob. It's this team before the Four Nations, they would get scored on, and then next thing you know, there's another one in the back of the net and another one in the back of the net, and they're hanging their heads, skating around in circles. And now past Four Nations, we know that even if they get scored on a power play or whatever, they know that they're not out of the game, because they're not just outscoring teams like Doug Armstrong said. They're dominating them in the stat columns, and that's what you want. You want a team that's going to win, not just outscore them and prey on Jordan Binnington to stand on his head and get you a win, because that's not a consistent way to win in the NHL. So I think building off of all of that and building momentum down the stretch, I think is going to be crucial for this team. Like I said, especially without Colton Parayko, how will Matthew Kessel step up? How will Justin Falk step up? How will the defense as a whole eat those minutes that Colton Parayko is now leaving on the table for them? And there's going to be some people that rise to the occasion, and there's going to be some people that we're going to start looking at more closely as scapegoats. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, and all of that's going to affect whether they make the playoffs, whether they don't, but also what Doug does in the offseason in the summer, because his comments were also talking about how he was kind of laying the groundwork for potential deals. Obviously not at this trade deadline, but in the offseason too. So, and a lot of those he said were hockey trades. So it's one guy going in and one guy going out and one guy coming back. So if you're a player and you hear that, the pressure's on, right? You don't want to be one of those guys going out. You want to keep your place and earn your place. So the Blues have the opportunity to do that across the board.
And another quote from Army, kind of going back on the talk about kind of proving the point of these past few games, really changing the mind. Army said, if we had talked to teams over the last couple of weeks coming out of the Four Nations, we were very active in seeing what we could do. As our team started to progress, we wanted to wait and see how they did. The last couple of days, we were in contact with teams on hockey trades, like you said. And continuing on that, said, when you go to bed, you say, should we look at moving other guys out? We talked about a whole host of things, but we just felt what we could do, we weren't comfortable doing, which means pretty much from what I'm taking it is he liked what they were seeing coming out of the break, and it resulted into what I'm interpreting as what the guys did and what they have now made themselves worth, they were not getting in return whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think it's just like he said, like you have this seller's mentality going into the Four Nations break, and then you come out of the Four Nations break and this team looks completely different. So slowly those scales start to shift, and guys start to show you like, hey, you don't have to make a move just to make a move, or try to, light a spark under this team to try to wake them up because they're not playing like you want them to, because by every account since the Four Nations break, they've been playing fantastic. So they don't really need that wake up call anymore. They don't need to, I feel like the Brandon Saad, waving him and then him going to Vegas, yeah, obviously that experiment wasn't really working, at least during this season. And so you're trying to make your team better, obviously, but at the same time, moving a guy that has such a veteran presence like that out of the locker room, I think if you're anyone in that locker room, you're like, oh God, at any given point in the season, I could be on the chopping block if Brandon Saad's on the chopping block, because he's that's one of the grizzled veterans that you could have gotten on the team. So I think just instilling that in everyone's mind, nobody's safe, everyone's play, their minutes, their opinion in Doug Armstrong's mind is based off of what have you done for me lately and what are you doing for me right now, your compete level, all of those things. So I think culminating all of that into one big package has given us the team that we're watching today.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned some of the young guys, and looking at some of the comments, do you think we see Snuggerud and Dvorsky next year? I think Dvorsky is a definite possibility for next season. I think we could possibly even see Snuggerud following the Frozen Four this year. That's a name that's been tossed around. It's certainly a possibility. I think that's after this deadline, the possibility of Snuggerud coming up, I think, has honestly increased.
Yeah, I'll put it this way. I'll be surprised if we don't see him, at least from the comments that Doug Armstrong has made and everybody. It seems like the second that Minnesota loses, they're get him over here ASAP. So, and they need all the right-handed shots they can get. They've got 5 on the team total right now after Colton Parayko goes down and they call up Matthew Kessel. So, it's just another added layer. And obviously the dude's pedigree and his resume in college hockey right now is gorgeous. So you want to bring him over and hopefully it provides a spark to this team that's still in the playoff race. And then who knows, if you make it to the playoffs, maybe he's a bona fide warrior and just puts the team on his back. Anything can happen. That's a top prospect in this system. You never know how they'll pan out in the NHL. And sometimes they flop right away. Sometimes it takes a long time to develop, but a lot of times, especially with these college guys, they jump in and they're just crushing it right away. Maybe Jimmy Snuggerud falls into that category. That'd be awesome.
Just a reminder, you can always catch our live shows after the fact right here on Sports Hub STL YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe and turn on some notifications as well. Check us out on all the other socials, Twitter, Instagram, the whole works. And then also go check out the rest of our content over on sportshubstl.com. So I think kind of to get some final thoughts, just to kind of broaden everything. You look around the league and what happened. The biggest shock, I think, was the Marchand trade. Bruins giving Marchand to Florida for essentially a loaf of bread in that conditional second rounder in 2027, which could become a first rounder if the Panthers make it to the Eastern Conference Final. So that just is what the heck. But obviously, I do not care about the Bruins. 2019 is the best day of my life, or best year, summer, whatever. Anyway, but looking at what the rest of the league did, and as we mentioned, it was very much a seller's market this season. The Blues doing nothing to us, to the Blues fans, and just looking at the team as one. It's not the worst thing. It's not the best thing. It was just like kind of expected. Wouldn't have been surprised if something would have moved, though. But you look at the rest of the league, especially in the Central. Stars picking up Rantanen. The Jets picking up some pieces as well. I believe the Wild got a piece from the Bruins. Surprise, surprise. Bruins, another just kind of throw over. But
in Colorado got Brock Nelson.
They got Charlie Coyle. Which was insane as well. So the rest of the Central getting some big pieces. Does that kind of say with not just the Central, but the rest of the league and all that happened with the position the Blues are in, should they have made a trade? Do you think?
It's easy. Well, I think if we get to the offseason and there's a lot of movement for the Blues, or at least we don't see – let's say we don't see this playoff push, right? Or like the Blues, by typical Blues fashion, miss out on the playoffs by like one game or something stupid again, because it never fails to happen that we just end up in NHL purgatory in between like a lottery pick and making the playoffs. So let's say worst case scenario that happens, right? And then we get to the offseason. If Doug Armstrong doesn't start wheeling and dealing, then I think I'm nervous, right? Because like we said, we just outlined, like the Central Division was very active at this trade deadline. And it makes sense because the Central Division is stacked and there's a lot of good playoff teams there. So they want to load up to try to make a Stanley Cup run. The Blues aren't in that same position, but they are in the same division. So you have to at least be able to compete for like a wild card spot. So if all those guys are going and beefing up their lineups, the Blues got to beef their lineups up too, to make sure that, they've got the same capacity to at least compete next year as the rest of the division. So it's just taking all of that into consideration. Like if you got Doug Armstrong in the offseason, this upcoming offseason in the summer, and he's not wheeling and dealing, that's when I'll be concerned. Okay, are the Blues lagging behind and all of those things? Like, are the Blues a step behind the rest of the Central Division because the Central Division's making all of these deals and the Blues are just kind of standing pat? Now, at the same time, if the Blues do make the playoffs and they look like a wagon down the stretch, like even if they don't win in the first round, but they push like a quality team to game 7, I'll be like, maybe you don't have to wheel and deal in the offseason, but one of those needs to happen, right? I either need to see this team show me that it has a chance to compete with the big dogs, which is possible the way that they're playing right now, or I need to see Doug be like, okay, this isn't working. I thought we were getting a hot streak, but we need to go back to the drawing board. Not necessarily blow it up, but let's retool and try to bring in some more core pieces, and he can potentially do that in the offseason. So one of those two things needs to happen for me to feel comfortable about the Central Division and the St. Louis Blues.
Apologies for popping off. I went to check the standings and just hit my bookmark bar and completely took over this tab. But talk about the standings right now. Blues 2 points out of that wild card spot. Calgary 68 points coming into tonight. Vancouver 67, Blues 66. So it goes 1 point, then 2 points as we just started today's games, which I'm sure are just going to be very interesting following the rest of how crazy the league was. Certainly say, though, if I'm Doug Armstrong, and this is my opinion, certainly watching the Minnesota State High School Hockey League tournament going on right now, it's the best week in all of hockey. So
great hair, I've heard.
I always got to bring it up. I always do. It's semifinal Friday. It's the best day of the hockey tournament. And just got to mention it one time. Always got to do it. I know it's a St. Louis thing, but I gotta call back to my hometown. But there's a lot of great players, and I will say there's a lot of great players that hopefully they also come to the St. Louis area, which would be nice to play at Lindenwood. And obviously we've seen that they're trying to get pull in a little bit more from that area. But no, I think there's a lot to do prospect wise. Kind of looking forward. There's a lot of good hopes. And talking about Minnesota again, Jimmy Snuggerud, he could make a big impact if he does join the Blues, which we all think he will. And obviously we got some big names coming up, some good guys in Springfield. Dvorsky's tearing it up so far. And that's pretty much how it kind of settles. And like you said, it's right now we can't really tell if the Blues should have made a trade or not. But I guess that's one of those things where just time will tell. Mm-hmm. And as of right now, like we said, Blues sit 2 points out. There is belief. I think Doug believes, the city of St. Louis believes they can pull it off. And we certainly believe as well. So just a reminder, we will also have Blues Hub postgame tonight, another late show. Ducks and Blues, Cam Fowler returning to Anaheim for the first time. It'll be a big game, obviously, for the Blues. Some big games also going on in the West. So, but that will be another late show here. So certainly stick around after the game if you are up late. And we will have that here. Ethan Hannaford and I will cover that. But that will do it for us. Thomas, thank you for hopping on and talking the trade deadline. Obviously not too much to talk about, but it has come and it is gone. And this is how we stand now. So that will do.
Yeah, I always appreciate talking puck with you. It's always a great time. But I will just say, as a closing comment, trades can there's only two ways that trades can go. They can either go great or they can go bad, right? So in hindsight, like if you're the Colorado Avalanche and you trade Mikko Rantanen to the Hurricanes, right? You're like, oh, this is great. Maybe we couldn't have re-signed him, but we got assets and all that stuff. And we don't have to deal with him. And then they trade him back to the Dallas Stars, and you're looking at potentially a round one matchup against an old friend. I mean, that's going to be must-watch TV if that does happen, because it's that's a matchup like you read about. But thankfully for the Blues, they don't have to worry about whether it was good or bad. They just have to, ride the wave of this team and how they're treating us right now. So let's cheer them on for a win against the Anaheim Ducks. I think I've still got the prediction of a 4-1 victory looming over my head. So fingers crossed that comes to fruition. It feels like this is another must win for this team because the Ducks are kind of right behind you in terms of points. So we'll see what happens. Should be fun.
I think my one prediction for tonight's game, I think Jake Neighbors scores again. That's going to be my prediction. But
assisted by Robert Thomas to keep the point streak going.
Ooh, I like that. I like that a lot. All right. That will do it from us. Thank you for joining us here for this instant reaction. Thomas Welch and Jacob Stanoch. This has been Blues Hub Instant Reaction right here on Sports Hub STL.